The morning sky over Mason Creek was unervingly quiet. The mist hung low over the rolling hills, hugging the wheat fields like a secret trying to stay hidden. John Parker stood at the edge of his property, his boots sunk into the damp soil, his arms crossed against the chill. He had lived on this farm his entire life, but today, it didn't look like his farm anymore. Where his north pasture had once stretched in endless gold, a black strip of asphalt now cut across the land like a scar. White painted lines glared back at him, pristine and freshly marked, as if mocking his memory of what used to grow here. John's jaw tightened. He wasn't just angry, he was stunned. The Homeowners Association for the newly built subdivision next to his land had apparently decided that their neighborhood needed a private community airstrip. They hadn't asked. They hadn't even warned him. They just rolled in their construction crews, bulldozed through his fence line, and paved over 40 acres of his farm like it was theirs to take. Behind him, his wife, Emily, stood silently, clutching a steaming mug of coffee that she hadn't touched. "This is illegal," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. John didn't answer. His mind was already racing. Illegal? Yes. But this wasn't just some HOA overreach. This was a violation of federal airspace regulations, property law, and about a dozen other statutes that he knew better than anyone else. Because John Parker wasn't just a farmer. He was the sitting director of the Federal Flight Administration. And if this HOA thought they could get away with building a runway through his land, they had just ignited a war they didn't understand. The first confrontation happened that very afternoon. The HOA president, a man named Richard Carver, pulled up in a shiny black SUV, dressed in an expensive polo and aviator sunglasses. He stepped out like he owned the place, grinning as if John should be thanking him. "Morning, Parker," Carver said smoothly, extending a hand. "Isn't she beautiful? A proper runway, finally. This is going to increase property values for everyone around here." John didn't take his hand. "You built this on my farm," he said flatly. Carver chuckled, like John was being silly. "Well, technically, the association voted to expand the easement. You know how it is, progress waits for no one. And honestly, your land was just sitting there, and used." John felt something in his chest snap. "And used," he growled. "That was my winter crop field." Carver's smile faltered just slightly, but his arrogance didn't. "Look, Parker, you'll be compensated. The community fund is putting together a payout package. In the meantime, we've already scheduled a ribbon-cutting ceremony next weekend. Maybe you and your wife can come down and..." John cut him off. "No planes are landing here." Carver laughed out loud. "Oh, they already are, my friend. First flight comes in tonight. You should come watch, it'll be quite a show." That night, John didn't sleep. He sat in his study, the glow of his desk lamp illuminating stacks of FAA manuals, case law binders, and federal codes. His fingers flew over the keyboard, pulling up every permit filed in the last year, every zoning request, every airspace authorization. There was nothing. The HOA hadn't just broken the law, they hadn't even filed the paperwork to make their little project look legitimate. When dawn broke, John had made his decision. He called Washington. 2 days later, the sound of rotor blades shook the morning air. Emily stood on the porch, shielding her eyes, as a pair of black and gold helicopters descended onto their driveway. Out stepped 3 men and 1 woman in dark suits, clipboards in hand, their badges glinting in the sun. John was already waiting at the fence line, arms folded, as Richard Carver came storming out of the subdivision to see what was happening. "What the hell is this?" Carver barked, pointing at the helicopters. John didn't flinch. "This," he said calmly, "is a federal inspection." Carver's smirk faltered as the inspectors strode past him, heading for the runway with measuring tools and cameras. "You can't do this," Carver snapped. John turned to face him fully, his voice cold. "I can do a lot more than this. You built an unregistered airstrip through federally regulated land, without clearance, without permits, and you're about to start flying unregistered aircraft over populated areas. This isn't just a property dispute, Carver, this is a matter of national airspace safety." Carver's face drained of color. And John continued, letting the weight of his title settle in the air between them, am the man who decides whether this runway ever sees another wheel touch down again. For the first time since this began, Carver didn't have anything to say. John allowed himself a thin smile. The war had officially begun. The inspectors worked all morning, walking the length of the newly built strip with precision, taking photos, dropping survey markers, even pulling core samples of the asphalt. By noon, they had already found half a dozen safety violations: wrong grade slope, improper lighting, no wind indicators, no emergency access roads. But John knew the worst was yet to come. At 2 p.m., the FAA's regional airspace chief called him back. They didn't just build this runway illegally, the voice on the other end said grimly. They built it under an approach path for Mason Creek Municipal Airport. If they try to land so much as a Cessna, they risk mid-air collision with commercial traffic. John pinched the bridge of his nose. This was even bigger than he thought. Shut it down, he said. Already filed the notum, the official replied. Effective immediately, that strip is closed until further notice. We're dispatching an enforcement team to put up physical barriers. John exhaled slowly, a grim satisfaction rising in his chest. But the war wasn't over. Not even close. By evening, Richard Carver had mobilized the entire HOA board. They stormed down the gravel road to John's house, 5 SUVs pulling up one after the other like a convoy. Out spilled a small army of neighbors, board members, and 2 men in suits who looked very much like lawyers. Carver was at the front, red-faced and shouting before his feet even hit the dirt. "You've gone too far, Parker," he yelled, striding right up to John, who stood calmly on his porch steps, hands in his pockets. "You can't just shut down our airstrip. You can't bring in the feds like this." "You built it on my land," John said evenly. Carver's lawyer stepped forward. "Mr. Parker, the association has voted to approve a special easement, granting us right-of-way across the disputed property. We will be filing that with the county clerk by morning. You are in violation of our community's progress plan." John stared at him for a long moment before letting out a humorless laugh. "Your easement is invalid the moment it interferes with federally regulated airspace," he said. "And you have no authority to grant yourselves aviation rights that requires FAA approval. You think hiding behind your title gives you power over us?" Carver snarled. John's expression hardened. "I don't have to hide behind anything." And as if on cue, a second convoy arrived, this time federal. Black pickup trucks rolled up, hauling portable barriers, flashing hazard lights. 2 agents stepped out with reflective vests and posted a large red and white sign at the entrance to the runway. "Runway closed, federal order, violators subject to penalty." Carver's face turned purple. "This isn't over," he spat. "We have investors, Parker. We have money on the line. You think you can scare us with bureaucratic red tape? We'll take this to the press. The county. The state. Hell, we'll take it to Congress if we have to." John stepped down from the porch, closing the distance until he was eye to eye with Carver. "You do whatever you think you need to do," he said quietly. "But let me make something very clear, this isn't about money. This isn't about property value. This is about keeping a sky full of passengers alive. And if you keep trying to open this strip, if you keep endangering my land and my airspace, I will bury this runway in enough federal injunctions to make sure nobody ever uses it again." Carver didn't answer this time. He just turned on his heel, gestured sharply to his entourage, and stalked back to his SUV. But as they drove away, Emily came to stand beside John, worry etched across her face. "They're not going to stop," she said softly. "I know," John replied. His eyes were locked on the runway in the distance, its black surface gleaming in the sunset like a challenge. The next week was all-out war. Carver and the HOA board filed a lawsuit, claiming that the FAA had overstepped its authority and that John had used his position to retaliate against them personally. Local news stations ran segments painting him as the rogue bureaucrat farmer, abusing federal power to keep progress out of his backyard. John received hate mail. Angry neighbors drove past the farm at night, laying on their horns, shouting threats from car windows. But he didn't back down. Each night, long after Emily had gone to bed, John sat at his desk, poring over airspace maps, safety audits, and legal precedents. He coordinated with Washington, submitting reports and affidavits, building a wall of evidence so airtight that even the HOA's high-priced lawyers would struggle to punch through it. And then came the breaking point. At 3 a.m. on a Thursday night, John was woken by a sound, the unmistakable drone of a small engine overhead. He threw on his boots, grabbed his flashlight, and sprinted outside just in time to see landing lights descending toward the strip. They were doing it. They were landing. In defiance of federal order. John's blood ran cold. He yanked his radio off the shelf and switched to the emergency frequency. Mason Creek Unicom, this is John Parker. Unauthorized aircraft attempting landing on closed strip. I repeat, unauthorized aircraft inbound. The response was immediate. Within minutes, the night sky roared to life as a pair of state police helicopters swept in, spotlights blazing. Sirens wailed down the road as sheriff's deputies raced toward the runway. The little plane, a private Piper Cherokee, had no choice but to abort its landing, pulling up sharply and banking away. John stood in the field, chest heaving, as the helicopters circled overhead. The HOA had just escalated the fight from a legal battle to a criminal one. And John was done playing nice. He turned back toward the house, his mind already working. If Carver wanted a war, John would give him one, but not the kind he could win in court. This was going to end in the sky. John didn't sleep after that night. By sunrise, he was already on the phone with Washington, his voice clipped and cold as he relayed the night's events. The FAA didn't hesitate. An unauthorized landing attempt on a federally closed strip was a direct violation of Title 14 CFR, Section 91.103. This wasn't just a civil infraction. This was federal. By noon, the order came through: emergency suspension of all aviation activity within 5 miles of the strip until further investigation. Mason Creek was officially under a federal flight restriction. Carver, predictably, went ballistic. By 2 p.m., news vans lined the road outside the farm. Reporters swarmed the property line, shouting questions, cameras flashing. Mr. Parker, are you abusing federal power for personal gain? Do you have a vendetta against the HOA? Are you targeting private citizens? John didn't answer them. Instead, he stood in front of the cameras, wearing his FAA jacket for the first time since this began. This is not about personal disputes, he said firmly. This is about air safety. Last night, an unauthorized aircraft attempted to land on an unapproved, illegal strip, without clearance, without lights, and directly under a commercial approach path. If that pilot had come 30 seconds later, he would have been on a collision course with a regional commuter flight. I will not allow Mason Creek to become a death trap because someone thought a private runway would boost property values. The clip went viral within hours. For the first time since this fight began, the public was on John's side. But Carver wasn't finished. 2 days later, just before dawn, John saw them, trucks, heavy equipment, and a small group of men moving onto the strip with fuel cans. Emily joined him on the porch, pulling her robe tight. What are they doing? They're planning a landing, John said grimly. Sure enough, moments later, he heard it, the distant hum of another small engine, growing louder. Carver had decided to defy the federal order one last time. John didn't hesitate. He grabbed his radio, switched to the tower frequency, and transmitted a single code phrase. Within minutes, the calm morning erupted into chaos. 2 black federal SUVs roared up the gravel road. Sirens wailed. And then, the sky filled with sound. From the horizon, a Coast Guard C-27 Spartan appeared, flying low and fast, followed by a pair of National Guard Black Hawks. Their engines thundered over the fields, making the earth tremble beneath John's boots. The men on the strip froze. Carver stood in the middle of the runway, arms outstretched, screaming something John couldn't hear over the roar. The Piper Cherokee descended, committed to landing, but this time, the Spartan banked sharply, flashing its landing lights in a warning pattern that every pilot knew meant divert now or face interception. The Piper pulled up at the last second, veering away just as the Black Hawks dropped in low, their rotors whipping dust across the field. Federal agents in tactical vests jumped out, shouting commands. Hands up! Step away from the runway! Within moments, the entire group, Carver included, was face down on the tarmac, zip ties around their wrists. John stood at the fence line, heart pounding. It was over. The following week, the HOA's airstrip was dismantled. Federal contractors tore up the asphalt, returning the north pasture to bare soil. Carver was charged with multiple counts of reckless endangerment, airspace violation, and obstruction of a federal order. The HOA board resigned in disgrace. John walked the length of the empty field one evening as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in streaks of red and gold. Emily walked beside him, her hand brushing his. "Feels strange," she said softly. "Quiet again." John nodded. "It's supposed to be quiet here," he said. He stopped, crouched down, and scooped up a handful of dirt, letting it sift through his fingers. This land had been his father's before him, and his grandfather's before that. It had survived drought, storms, and now a runway war. Emily squeezed his shoulder. "You think they'll try again?" John looked out over the field, the horizon stretching endless and peaceful. "No," he said finally. "Not here. Not ever again." And for the first time since the asphalt scar had cut through his farm, John felt the tension leave his chest. He had fought, not just for his land, but for the sky above it, and he had won. As the last light faded, the wind swept softly across the field, carrying with it the promise of a quiet harvest.